With my pattern prepped and primed, it's for me to figure out if the pattern is fully correctly created. And it's not just the placement of the dots, which is making the garment look perfect. A simple way for me to test it is to move my dots. My choice to the shoulder dots. For me to get started, I traced my basic blocks again so that I can at least work from a proper fitting garment. Although the method I have chosen to move my dots may not seem ideal for some, but as I'm learning a new technique, dot manipulation, it was the quickest one I could think of, without physically drafting a copy and cutting it all out, just to manipulate it in the end. The first block I drew was my back. Yes, you can manipulate the back dot. One of the options I went with was a no side seam to ensure that the side seams are not the ones pulling funny as well. One of the things I thought of trying as well, which I wanted a cleaner finish, was the neckline. First I'm trying to draft a facing for the neck. Since all my patterns were originally drafted as net patterns, seam allowance were required for all. One of the things I clearly made sure of is to ensure that all the seams fully aligned as best as I could create it. But as I came to the shoulder seams, which will be something I'm not exactly happy about, but it's fully understandable due to my body shape and all, is that my shoulder seams, in where I chose to draft it, overlap one another when it comes to adding the seam allowance. Therefore, I had to cut my seam allowance on the side seams to be able to ensure that my shoulder seams fit correctly with enough seam allowance. I just add paper where needed, cutting the front and back bodice out with the pattern altered to having shoulder seam dots. was time to pin it to fabric and cut it out. Since it's been ages for me to be able to sew on using patterns on a fold, since I prefer to use my patterning options without using folds in it or double layers, which the reasoning behind it will come eventually when I get to my underwear or the making of my underwear. I did struggle with how to add the pattern on the fold. Something to remember is to mark where your dots start and end. Since I've chosen to use it as if it was simple seam allowance and I cut away most of the dot thickness, I still treated it as if it was dots. Redrafting the dots on the pattern, pinning the dots close. I do that on both the back and the front. My zipper will be placed in the front. That is why it got a center seam. Step 1 in sewing for me would be to sew everything that's supposed to be one piece of fabric to begin with, as to get it as one piece. Then sew the dots. Sewing all the things you can do on one piece of fabric, or the sewing to do with one piece of fabric only, helps with in the wrong run for me. Since this top is actually a simple sew together, next would be making sure all the pieces that need to be joined are joined. Since I'm planning on cutting the curves and stitching the flaps under, it was best to, in a way, sew my seam allowance on. And as you can see, I do have some trouble with the machine just because a few things broke on it, which I did replace. But one or two tiny things remained, which was easy to fix. I did manage to fix that. Those were the armholes that I marked the seam allowance for. Then it's to sew my shoulder seams together. That would be most of the actual item sewn together. Since I chose to do a neck hole facing, trying to figure out which way would be best for me to sew it on. Since I need to go into my patterning drawers because I inherited way too many, I need to double check how they tell you to actually sew your facings unless I can find it in one of my how to sew books. And yet again, thread snap. The reason why my thread keeps snapping is on the lower, by the bobbin side, there's a little spring thingy to ensure that your bobbin can move around and the timing is correctly. Part of that broke off and it created a bit of damage areas, which I did not know at the time. But the spring was replaced. That is why I felt confident enough to try and use the machine without knowing what the real reason why it still made my life a bit miserable. Seems like top stitching it in place. Some people will argue that under stitching would be a better option, but it's a mock-up, it's a trial run. I just need the seams to lay flat and properly, that's all. Pinning the facing properly to the actual garment to ensure that it doesn't move on me while I try and sew the other side to it. Like I said, first time trying something new, I will still hit the books on how to do it properly. Unless there's tons of people on the internet that want to give me advice on how to do it or point me in the right direction for it. But I don't mind the bit of top stitching I do. Once the facing was secure, I was left with one seam to sew, and this is just a precaution of where to fold the fabric when it comes to adding the zipper. The center front, trying my best to avoid the machine snapping the thread on me once again. Oh, I switch even to the zipper one. Normally I don't, because if I need to make mock-ups and not a proper thing, I tend to use as little setting change as humanly possible. And this is where the tiny error in why or additional damage the machine got decided to make my life a living nightmare. I did go quite slowly for this, just in the hopes that the thread doesn't snap on me. Are you sensing a pattern? Being irritated by a thread that keeps snapping on you, while you are desperate enough to try and make a mock-up as quickly as possible so you can get to the fitting where you take about 4 hours max to do a simple mock-up like this, only to find that it chooses to make your life a living nightmare where you end up doing half a mock-up a day, going from 2 to half. You really think I was happy that he wanted to threaten me to snap? Finally, I get to the parts where I would normally sew a second piece, like a skirt or sleeves on, that I chose to cut it quickly up or cut in the slices just to be able to have it. Clip your curves. The most important thing under the sun. If I can't put a flat ruler to it and see that it's practically straight, it gets a clip. My reasoning behind why I actually clip the width of the seam allowance away, then clip it in as if it's already sewn to something else, and then sew to the garment itself, is to ensure that I don't have a raw seam that can fray on me when doing a mock-up without doing a proper fitting, because keeping the seam allowance intact where it actually affects the fit of your garment actually causes a problem down the line when you actually have to sew those areas. And again, thread snaps. From there, it was an actual fitting. Which is where I discovered I had to do a bit of alteration. Where I felt super comfortable with to be able to create my final blocks. For this block, to ensure I drafted the final block properly, I triple checked the measurements. I also ensured that the curve was properly formed and will not create any fitting issues. This is where I took my time to ensure the pattern would not have any problems. Because once it does have problems, I would have ended up wasting money. And I'm not a fan of buying stuff just because I can buy it. I just checked to make sure that my waist seam allowance stayed the correct seam allowance and make sure that the side seams and back seams and dot seams all are on a set of centimeter where it doesn't go 5 centimeter or 5.8 centimeter while it's supposed to be 6 centimeters. That's how precise I chose to work. Some people will say this is extremely overkill to ensure that the pattern is that precise. But in all honesty, if I took a whole 3 weeks just to get this bodice the way it is now, with trial and errors, a machine that made my life miserable by making thread nesting, as if it's gone out of fashion, only because I did not realize a simple little spring by the bobbin case was broken. I would have not gone through all this effort to ensure that the final piece were properly done. I also marked where I want the notches to be for my sleeves that I'll eventually have to draw, only because I wanted to make sure my seams would fit me properly later on, and I wasn't going to focus on my seams straight after this one. I'm planning to do the skirt next, because that was the more important one for me to focus on. With the back done, I can quickly get the front done. And yes, my front dot is a lot smaller than my back dot. It's just I'm short-waisted. Following that extreme precision of making sure the pattern is fully working out by the front dots. Yeah, as you can see, I'm triple checking measurements that overlap between the front and back, just because I want to make sure that there's no additional easing that I have to do for each and every time I need to sew something. Last thing to do when it comes cutting out the basic bodice block on the pattern drafting paper was to ensure that the dots were folded correctly and to the right side. I prefer all my dots to go to the back, so I made sure that I folded my dot that it will be going to the back. And again, triple checking. The option of measuring once and you are safe, I really didn't believe in. Yeah, I end up grabbing my 270 grams per square meter thickness of paper. and slowly trace the actual bodice block. I did check to see if I can do the front and back on one piece of cardboard, but I could not. This size is an A3 that I chose to go with. Or is it now A2? I'll check. I end up grabbing the marker I would be writing the final information on to do my dots as well. Marking where I chose the notch to be. Something that I end up doing off camera was to add holes into where the dot point was and where the notch was. And also where the dot legs would be on the side seam, on the waist seam. Although I don't have a problem where people might think I'm throwing away my paper, but as a South African that does braai every Saturday, or most year round every Saturday, there are times that I don't. The family needs additional fuel for the fire to make sure it burns well. And that is what my scrap paper ends up going for. Will it stay like that? I don't know. But this particular paper I'm not planning on actually wasting because I needed my paper to be, I'm using this type of thickness for my bobbin lace patterns now as well because I want something thick to work with on my patterns so that I can make my lace. Pinterest is saying, here I am demonstrating, if Pinterest allows me, how the patterns will end up being if it overlaps. With my bodice block now fully ready that I can use for my actual